Welcome to Cyber Inspiration Podcast. My name is Evgeniy. I have been around cybersecurity for the last 20 years and I have a lot of experience working with a variety of cybersecurity vendors. My main work is vendor consulting and cybersecurity advisory for companies. As part of my passion in technology and cyber, I've been intrigued to learn how a company starts. I started the podcast to understand the thinking process and what motivated people to start their own company. This podcast is affiliated with Security Architecture Podcast. I have a pleasure today to talk to Jan. Can you please introduce yourself and speak about the company, what you guys do?
Thanks for having me. I'm Ian Matthews. I am an entrepreneur and a cybersecurity executive. I am currently the founder and president of WMC Global. WMC's focus is on detecting, disrupting, and attributing fraud, specifically mobile fraud. So we are a cyber threat intelligence organization. If I had to sum us up, we are the go-to company for brands, whether you're a bank or a credit union, whether you're a telecommunications carrier, whether you're in retail, but brands that are facing brand impersonation over mobile and have smishing going out to their employees and customers, we're the organization that can help you impact that in a positive way to help your business reduce the amount of fraud that it's facing.
Thank you. And it's a very important topic because I don't know anyone that doesn't have mobile phones right now. And while it's not supposed to be a very technical podcast, we're just diving in more to what the inspiration to start the company and the journey. I do want to maybe explain to people that are listening to us right now, is there a big difference between mobile fraud and a regular fraud that comes to your laptop, for example?
Well, the end result is the same, right? Fraud and identity theft, money changing hands, PII getting exposed. But yeah, there is a big difference. And the big difference is that text messaging has a 98% open rate within 90 seconds. Email doesn't get anywhere close to that. So I think a lot of organizations are still thinking a lot about email fraud hitting their employees and phishing emails and looking at security to be able to tackle that. But the mobile fraud for most organizations is a blind spot that sits outside the SOC, right? Because your employees' personal phones are not in your visibility. And more, that is where this fraud is taking place, is on their mobile devices. So if you think about the doomsday scenario for a board, it's a ransomware incident, right? That's the last thing that folks want to deal with. And it's a topic that gets discussed, in the boardroom. It gets discussed by law enforcement. It is what nobody wants to face. But I think there's actually way too much focus on the ransomware itself, because by the time that's happened, it's too late. You've got an encryption event, you're negotiating with a fraudster, you are calling your cyber insurance provider, and you're having a very, very bad day. But a lot of this exposure that results in that type of incident or other types of breaches start with an identity compromise, right? It starts with somebody getting access to an employee's work system. And more, this is happening on mobile because of that open rate, because the eyeballs are on that mobile device, because people get anxiety when they don't read an alert or open a message because they want to know what's going on. And this is where scammers can create a sense of urgency. And it's not just about phishing your bank details anymore, right? It's getting access to corporate systems. And most organizations don't have visibility into that. And so that's an area that they face a lot of challenges, and we work to help them out with.
This is a very good explanation as well. I think it's very important. And yes, I myself, we get text messages all the time. And while Android and Apple trying to reduce the spam, it's still quite visible and people opening this all the time. Let's go back in time and see where you guys started, what was the inspiration and some of the challenges and how you guys overcome some of the challenges. So you guys been around for around 20 years, correct?
That's correct. So founded the company in 2006. But if we want to go back in time a little bit further than that, because it started a little bit earlier. So I and some of the early employees of WMC Global actually worked for a startup in Northern Virginia called InfoMatch in the early 2000s, which was the first FMS interconnect vendor. So in the days when text messaging was a new technology, if you had a newer phone and you had a friend who had a similar piece of new technology and you wanted to text each other, you had to be on the same wireless network. So there wasn't interoperability in those early days. And so we helped build out the plumbing to enable that connectivity and helped messaging sort of turn into what it became today in our small part. And so I think everything that I've done across the course of my career has kind of been informed by that early experience. So after that, and ultimately what led to the founding of WMC, I worked in the world of pre-smartphone digital content. So think polyphonic ringtones, wallpapers for your flip phone, Java brew games, stuff that seems pretty goofy by today's high-tech standards. But in those days, it was the latest technology and it was moving very fast. And the way to monetize that business was through a frictionless billing mechanism called premium SMS, which was basically a modification of the SMS billing protocol to allow for a premium text message above and beyond what you would normally get charged at the time, which in those days was probably 10 cents or 15 cents per message. There were no unlimited packages back then. It was new tech, it was high margin. And so this premium charge was basically a message that was used as a billing event for a product or service rendered. And that was an interesting business, right? It was basically reliant on the early advertising networks, predominantly took place online. So, the early days of Google AdWords before the DoubleClick acquisition, early days of affiliate marketing. But basically, the idea was get as many eyeballs on your ringtone or your content offer as possible. And if your cost to acquire a customer was less than your average revenue per customer over a period of time, you had a business model that worked. And then you just had to have enough cash flow to buy the advertising and scale the business. And I'll come back to why that's important in a little bit. But in those days, it was the Wild West in that ecosystem. And what we discovered quite quickly is we ended up having to compete with a lot of companies that were prepared to, well, ultimately commit fraud, not inform users that they were going to be billed for this content, sometimes not even delivering any product or service of value at all, or removing the pricing from these offers after 10 o'clock at night and then running all their advertising traffic then. And so we found it difficult to compete. And because we understood how that ecosystem ran so well, and also had the relationships with the wireless networks, we decided to make a pivot and to form an intelligence product that would develop intelligence around mobile billing fraud and the user experience of interacting with it. And once we took that capability to our friends at the wireless networks and got some positive feedback, made some modifications at their request, we closed our first deal, and then our second deal, and our third deal, and ultimately we ended up spinning WMC Global off as a separate entity in late 2006, and that's really where it started. So we saw a problem. We didn't want to have to go down to the level that some of our competition was going in terms of how they were making money, and so we said, well, we're not content to do that. Let's form a product that levels the playing field and tries to keep the ecosystem as fraud-free as possible.
I love that. This is very, very important. And yeah, fraud has become main part. And also right now we have the deep fakes and many, many other options to do it.
Yeah.
When you decided to open a company, if I understand correctly, you didn't raise money right away.
No, we didn't raise money until 2025.
Wow. What was the decision that impacted this part? Why not to raise money earlier?
Well, I think a couple of reasons. We were fortunate that we were already running a small but successful business in this digital content space. And so that gave us the flexibility to launch a new company without needing to raise a bunch of capital. And we were able to self-fund it. And that gave us a tremendous amount of control, right? We didn't have investors trying to steer the direction of the business. We got to make our own decisions about how we wanted to run it and how we wanted to scale it. And because we'd had those early successes, we just didn't need to take the outside money. Now, there's a bit of debate over whether or not that was the right decision in hindsight. And, we've gone through a lot of twists and turns doing the bootstrap thing for almost 20 years. But at the time, we simply didn't want that outside influence.
So what changed?
Well, I think a lot of things changed. Almost 20 years is a long time. And, WMC Global went through a number of different iterations over time. So the product that we built around mobile billing fraud doesn't exist anymore. And in fact, it's interesting because we became quite successful with that offering, and it ultimately, led to us expanding across the UK, Australia, Singapore, and Malaysia by 2012. So still relatively early in the organization. But also over the course of the next few years, due to regulatory pressures and due to fraudsters getting more aggressive with how they were trying to commit their fraud, that billing mechanism, especially around the time that Google and Apple were launching the app stores and a lot of the billing transactions started running through them as opposed to directly on wireless bills, those billing mechanisms kind of died a slow death over the course of the next 5 to 10 years globally. And so ultimately, that was a situation where we had to pivot pretty quickly and launch some new things to be able to ensure that we didn't end up in a business-ending event because the market that we were protecting was just going away. So ultimately, we started taking a look at other types of fraud, specifically smishing and other fraud that was delivered over just regular text messages as opposed to premium. And we were able to deliver products and services into our existing customer base, which was primarily wireless carriers, but also to expand out into a much more target-rich environment, going into financial services, going into retail, doing some work with governments. And so when we expanded beyond just that sort of niche billing ecosystem, we were able to really open up ourselves to a much, much larger client base. But I think, when you bootstrap an organization and you're successful at it, it's still a lot of trade-offs. You're still always making compromises on where do we invest money? Do we invest in filling this role, or do we just sort of leave that on the sideline and we'll figure out how to pay for it later? You win two contracts, you lose one contract. You lose two contracts, you win one contract, right? You two steps forward, one step back. So there's a lot of that challenge over time. If you're not able to scale to a large enough organization early enough in the process, you're just sort of constantly playing that tug of war with yourself. And I think by the time we get to mid 2024 and really started thinking about making decisions about raising capital, it was pretty much at a peak time of burnout. And I think that was one of the key drivers into saying, you know what, let's look at doing it a different way, because I don't want to do it the same way that I've done it for this long anymore. And, so I think part of it was a personal decision. And part of it was, this is probably the right decision for the organization at this point in time to help it sort of move on to its next phase of growth.
Is this decision made by the market or by the customer demand? Like, how did this navigate? Because I'm guessing you can look on the market and say, okay, we need to go this way. Or did you actually ask your customers what they want to see, like get the feedback from them? Was there like a special events that happened?
It's a great question. And I think it's a multifaceted answer. So we did a lot of experimentation in the first 10 years. And I think we tried to open up other markets. We actually created a couple of companies we wanted to spin off into different brands. And I think the mistake we made in doing that is we didn't do enough market validation. And we actually went out to try and solve problems that were problems for sure, but there were problems that certain potential customers didn't necessarily want to spend money to solve. And so I think we made that early error of thinking we knew the market better than the market knew itself. And that is something we learned kind of the hard way when some of those initiatives weren't successful. When we sort of set about reinventing WMC and focusing on that broader ecosystem of fraud, looking at smishing and social engineering and malware and some of those things, we actually took the feedback directly from the market. And really, one of the first customers we had in that space was a client that came to us and said, we think that there are some challenges with mobile spam that you might be able to help us with. And when we kind of dug in on that problem, we said, well, we think it's less of a spam problem. Spam's more a question of, did a user consent to receiving this message, and are they unhappy with their customer experience and text messaging? And we said, when you look through all that stuff that's being classified as spam, there's some black and white data here that says you have smishing, you have fraud. Fraud is not something you opt into and then get regret later and say, I want to report this as spam. Fraud is something that is black and white. It's fraud. It's illegal. And we kind of said, let's focus on that problem, not the spam problem, but the fraud problem. And really being able to help tackle that in the wireless industry led us to say, well, there's a gaping hole here in the market around an organization that can help the financial services community with this problem, because everybody's a target, right? Every brand in the universe is being imitated these days if they're big enough. But the ones that ultimately feel the most pain, aside from the consumer that's actually losing real money, are the financial institutions, because they're the ones that are holding the money. So they're the biggest targets. And so we set out to say, what are the gaps in the market where the banks, aren't getting help with this growing problem? How can we help them learn about this wireless ecosystem? Because that wasn't the main focus for them at that point in time. And that's really what led us into that space, is looking at how do we build bridges between that financial services ecosystem and that wireless carrier ecosystem. Because if you think about the Venn diagram of a wireless customer and a bank customer, it's a circle, right? It's the same people. Everybody's got a bank account. Everybody's got a cell phone. Everybody reads their text messages, and scammers know this. And they know that they have a target-rich environment, that have money, have bank accounts, and that they can use text messaging to convince people with a high degree of read rate that they should enter information into a malicious website because they think that they're interacting with their bank instead of a scammer. And so that's the problem that we really set out to solve.
What helps you be more creative when you think about ways to solve the problem, or which problem you want to solve?
Well, I think what's helped us be creative has really been saying, how do we take this specific domain knowledge around how the wireless networks were built, how they're exploited, how they're marketed as legitimate communication channels, and apply it to a completely different problem. So, the folks that were our colleagues in previous businesses, whether it was selling ringtones or sending text messages, a lot of them are still doing that, right? They're trying to make money by sending text messages, by enabling businesses to connect to messaging platforms. They're focused on building new products around the evolution of text messaging, like RCS and Apple Messages for Business and things like that. Whereas our approach has always been, how do we take that knowledge and do something completely different with it, and look at how does our understanding of how this ecosystem works and how can we use this to solve problems that aren't being solved today in terms of fraud. And so I think we just view the universe through a bit of a different lens. We try and think differently and say, what problems aren't being solved, and does our experience in this relatively niche wireless space allow us to help those organizations tackle them? Because the folks in the financial services community, they really don't understand how these mobile networks actually work. They don't understand that, you really can't spoof a text message in the United States generally, but you can spoof a voice call, right? They don't necessarily understand that there's, pretty close to a dozen different ways to send a text message, and they all go through different pipes and different types of security controls. And it's all of this knowledge that, other organizations use to make money, building products to scale up the sending of text messages, that we said, well, we can make money by helping people. We can make money by applying this knowledge and using it to create better security for those end users, and in turn help our customers reduce fraud, and drive a better fraud-free experience for their customers.
That is very important and a lot of information here, because yeah, even right now, the text messages are not exactly text messages like 20 years ago. 20 years ago, you didn't know somebody read the text message, or you can do thumbs up on a text message. There's a lot of changes and versions and ways to send them right now as well. Very, very smart. Is it touching WhatsApp, Telegram, and other communication on the mobile as well?
Yeah, 100%. So, when you think about text messages, you have a number of different protocols, but it's really, really important to understand them. So you've got SMS, right, which is sort of a catch-all term that gets used for a bunch of stuff today, but that's actually incorrect, right? SMS is an actual technical protocol. You've got MMS, which is a multimedia message, which allows you to attach, images or videos. You now have RCS, which is Rich Communication Services, which is sort of, I guess it's kind of SMS 2.0. It's a standard that's been around for over a decade, that was originally developed by the GSMA, and ultimately is being serviced primarily by Google as a technical backbone. It's sort of what I would call a hybrid service, meaning it's got a lot of features of an over-the-top service like WhatsApp, but it's not 100% over the top, because it still needs a SIM card to operate. It still needs integration with the carrier networks, whereas something like WhatsApp or iMessage is true over the top, because it just goes over the data connection, and the carrier doesn't really have any part in it other than providing a data connection, and it can also operate, without necessarily being on the mobile device, right? You can send a WhatsApp message from your computer, almost more akin to a chat service, of the late 90s from that perspective. But it's important, and especially now, and something I talk about a lot is that, RCS and iMessage and WhatsApp are end-to-end encrypted. So what that means is that previously, SMS and MMS are not end-to-end encrypted. So the wireless carriers can see the content that's flowing through the network as it goes. And in some respects, a good thing, because they can install technologies. I mean, there's a few big tech companies that provide these, but firewalls that sit inside the messaging flow, and they have about 10 milliseconds to make a decision on whether or not they're going to block something they think is malicious. And so there's actually, it might surprise a lot of folks, there's actually a ton of stuff that's blocked. Despite people feeling like there's always a new scam message out there that's coming, there's a lot of stuff that gets stopped in transit, and nobody really talks about that. And so we do have to give credit where credit's due, that does happen. But 10 milliseconds is not a lot of time, even for a computer, to make a rapid decision, right? But with RCS and iMessage, that's gone. So in September of 2024, when Apple finally did a deal with Google to enable support for RCS on iOS, and pushed out iOS 18, and enabled the majority of devices over the next 12 months to basically be compatible with RCS, that content filtering in a large part went dark, because the vendors that the carriers have inside the mobile network never see that, because it doesn't traverse the mobile network in the same way. And so now we have this interesting situation where you have this duopoly of protection from Google and Apple. And to your point, earlier, they're doing some stuff and it's okay and it's on device and all that. But that's not their core business, right? Google and Apple are not security companies. Google's a search company, Apple's a hardware company, and they're doing some good stuff to try and catch this stuff. But it's not their core business. And so one thing I advocate for a lot is, we really want Google and Apple to open up access on device to security vendors to be able to actually do a better job on the device than they can do themselves. Give consumers the choice on who they want to manage their security, because right now they don't have a choice. And there's no real competition because Google and Apple aren't really competing with each other on security. They're competing with each other on market share for sure, on phones and OSs. But we're kind of in this weird transitional phase where scammers have figured this out, right? They figured out the carriers can't see this content. They figured out that Google and Apple, it's not the core thing that they're offering. They figured out if they use these encrypted channels in combination with some really generic scams, right? And everybody's seen these at this point, right? The toll road violation notices, even if you don't use a toll road. Your package delivery scams, you've got an Amazon package coming, you've got a UPS package coming, right? That took off over COVID. They figured out that if they can do this over encrypted channels where there's less filtering and they're so generic that one attack may yield banking information from dozens of different financial institutions. Now the losses are spread out. It's very difficult to attribute where that fraud's coming from. It's very difficult to hit a financial threshold for the FBI to come and investigate, open a case, for example, to go after threat actors, because the FBI does go after these types of scams if the losses are big enough, that the scammers can live in this sort of gray area, right? Live in the cracks. And so between that and with the surge in phishing as a service, where the operators are not even coding anymore, they're just leasing, a scam, right? It's software as a service. And you bring in jailbroken AI models that are now integrated, and messaging sending that's now integrated through phone farms. And you bring all this together. You don't need to be a sophisticated actor to run a successful scam and steal millions and millions of dollars in a very short amount of time. And so this is a really, really challenging time for the ecosystem of defenders, because it's also difficult for organizations to take responsibility for fighting the fraud when it's so fragmented like it is today. And so this is something that I think isn't talked about enough, and is certainly something that I try and share with organizations so that we can figure out, the next wave of fraud is here. What's the next wave of defense? And that's what we need to be talking about.
Love it. What can you recommend people that listen to us right now, what they can do on their devices to be more kind of aware?
That's a tricky one, right? In
Yeah.
terms of being more aware, so there is a place for education, right? Like folks need to be aware of what's out there and what they're facing. A lot of folks will sort of write off security awareness training as kind of, oh, that's useless. Everybody's just ticking a box for their cyber insurance company. And sure, everybody is taking a box for their cyber insurance company. And I do think that ecosystem needs to evolve to do more simulations on mobile, because right now I'm not aware of a product that does mobile simulations. They do training, they do videos you can watch and you can sort of think about it, but they don't do the simulations on text message, for example, like they do emails where you get
Yeah.
an email to test you. So I think that ecosystem needs to evolve to embrace text messaging, because that is more and more not just a consumer problem, it is an enterprise problem. You think about the text that every company has received around, you get a text from your CEO saying, hey, I'm in a meeting, I can't talk right now, but I need some help. Can you go buy some gift cards at Walmart for me? It's for a client for the Christmas party. These scams work because they know people are going to read them on their mobile device. They know they can create a sense of urgency. They know folks are intimidated when they get a text message from the CEO. They want to do a good job. They want to look good. They are worried about their job stability in the current job market, and so folks respond to that. So that's a challenge, because the way that these scams work, they create that sense of urgency, and it's not that people that fall for these are stupid, and that's really, really important to stress, because I think there is a lot of victim shaming in this space when people fall for these types of attacks. They're distracted, right? They're worried about the economy. They've maybe just had a kid and they have only had 3 hours of sleep. They just got off an airplane and are jet lagged. Maybe they've had a little bit too much to drink and they're worried about their finances, and they get a text saying that something's gone wrong with their bank account. And so this is part of the problem, where awareness alone is only part of the puzzle. So I think it's certainly being aware, being diligent, thinking before you click, thinking, does this make sense, is important for individual people to do. But are you really going to think that when you get a text message saying that your grandson has been kidnapped and the person on the other end of the text is going to murder them if you don't wire money in the next 15 minutes? No, you're not. Why take the risk? And that's why some of these scams work. So I think it's a combination of that awareness, but I also think we need to continue to develop better technology. And it's not always up to the user, whether it's an employee or a consumer. We can't just say it's their responsibility not to fall for stuff because that's A, not fair to them, and B, it's not realistic. And so I think we need better tech. Now, how do we get better tech? We need more collaboration. We need more cross ecosystem collaboration. We need more wireless networks collaborating with financial institutions. We need government taking a stronger stance on fighting fraud and addressing it more aggressively through regulation. We also need regulators to think long and hard about the conflict of consumer privacy regulation and consumer protection, because right now they're at odds. Right now, data that could be shared to help make a material difference in these types of attacks, whether it's impacting consumers or companies or both, it's not being shared because it's regulated data and it's either considered PII or it's considered other types of regulated data. And so organizations, to some extent, are using privacy regulation as a shield to not do things, as opposed to figuring out, hey, how do we navigate this privacy regulation to do the thing, but do it in a way that's compliant, isn't going to get us in trouble. So I hear GDPR cited a lot, and there's some other regulations globally that are GDPR equivalents. There's data types like CPNI in the US. And so I think that there is a legislative job to be done here, carving out provisions in these privacy regulations to enable data sharing under certain conditions to protect these users. So I think there's a lot of pieces that need to come together to make a material difference. But from a purely data and technical perspective, it's possible. And I think the thing to really highlight is the threat actors don't have these constraints because they're breaking the law. They do not care about these regulations. And so they just ignore them. Whereas businesses, they do have to care about them. And that's a legitimate concern. And they have to think about liability, and they have to weigh that against, the other risks that they have. And I think that's a sad state of affairs, but it is the state of affairs nonetheless. And so we have to make some major changes if we're going to be able to address that.
Thank you. Last question for today, not technical one. How do you balance work-life balance? Like, what do you do, when there's too much stuff going on at work? Do you meditate, run, spend time with the family? But basically, what are you trying to do to achieve this work-life balance?
You go raise some money so that you're not bootstrapping it anymore. But no, all jokes aside, and that is a true statement. I mean, that was part of the decision, right? I think it's a challenge because as an entrepreneur, it's really hard to switch off. But I think sometimes you have to say, you know what, I am going to go on vacation for 2 weeks, and I am going to, maybe not switch my phone off, but leave it in the hotel room or whatever, and be able to take those breaks. I think early in the days of the company, I was just afraid to take time off. It was almost like a badge of honor. I haven't taken vacation in 3 years, and look how hard I'm working. And that's just not sustainable, and it's not smart. And so I think you have to force yourself to get that work-life balance. But I think it's different for every person. But for me, it's stepping away from the screen. It's getting outside. It's maybe spending some time in nature, going for a walk, just trying to separate your brain from all the the worries and the stress. And I think it's really valuable not only for just founder mental health, but also for making better business decisions. Because if you never step away from it, you're stuck in your own echo chamber, and you're never going to grow. And so I think just being able to even if it's for 15 minutes, just walk away from it and clear your brain, whether it's just going for a walk or whether it's through meditation or something else, it's a really important step for not just founders, but business people in general.
Sounds good. Ian, thank you very much. It was a very good episode. I learned a lot about mobile as well, and I hope our listeners learned as well. And we'll raise some awareness and maybe go ask their companies, what are you guys doing to protect our mobile devices as well?
Great. Well, thanks so much for having me.
Thank you.